Ended up getting a bunch of comments in the section on my moon hoax videos, which would be interesting in itself. So I thought I would answer some of those questions out loud. I answered most of them in the comment section, but really a lot of that's just for algorithmic purposes. It makes more sense to basically do it out here verbally, where it's a little bit easier to follow what's going on, because really the comment section in YouTube is pretty hideous in terms of how things line up. Not the best place for discussion, but there you are. So one of the first ones I got, gentleman says, "You are being dishonest, sir. I feel sorry for you. Do you need to do this?" Well, no, I didn't really need to do this. This was a class I taught to one of my homeschool high school classes, something they'd asked for. I just wanted to get into some of the science of how things worked. And it had pretty good notes, so it was pretty easy to turn it into a video series. So that was my primary purpose in doing it. I have no expectations of changing the mind of someone who's firmly in the camp that there's no way anyone could possibly go out into space. I have no hope at all of changing their mind, not even trying to. Uh, where it's useful to basically answer the questions they're bringing up is that there are people who weren't born in the time this happened. So this is pretty much ancient history for them. So what records we put out there are what they have to work off of in terms of coming up with a decision. So these videos I put up were entirely for the people who have not made up their minds, or alternately people who are in the camp but haven't thought through all the arguments and were looking for maybe a better explanation for some of the things that came up. A lot of this came about where some years back, a magazine that was a skeptic magazine basically put an article up being skeptical of the moon landing. And it was a kind of a difficult article for me to read initially, because I was like, well, how can they be taking this position? I'm like, well, wait a minute. If I'm being bothered by it, obviously there's something there that maybe I don't get. And then I realized, for as much as I like everything to do with the space program and everything else like that, I honestly don't fully understand all the science the way I'd like to. And they try to hit this on all fronts. And one of the areas I figured I had some background in because of what I did in the Air Force, I do understand radiation to a certain extent. I did a little bit more studying up on it, and I discovered that the people who are doing essentially the moon hoax research uh, aren't doing very good research. They don't understand the stuff they're saying. Now, in terms of the people who are corresponding with me in the comment section, all they're doing is relaying the stuff people have been essentially. A lot of these arguments started in the 70s, and for the most part, none of them have changed. And they sound good on the surface if you don't understand the science, and I can understand where they come from. It's like, well, here's all these things that don't sound like they're possible. How can this really be? And so I picked the one that I could get my brain around the best. And to a certain extent, I do admire people who believe the moon landing is a hoax, because you shouldn't believe the government. You shouldn't believe that just because they told you something is true. But something I think they fail on is they have too much trust in those who went before them in terms of the research they did, which wasn't very good. And the other problem is they don't have consistent means of falsifying their beliefs. Or in other words, anything that you believe in, unless it's absolutely an article of faith, you should be able to say, if X happens, I will either no longer believe the way I do or I will change the way I believe. And I think there is no point for a lot of these people where they would say nothing in the world will prove it for them short of them being dropped in the middle of a moon landing site. So, with that said, I'll get into some more of the comments, some responses, see what we got to say. And by the way, when I use kind of voices to speak what the other person's saying, I'm not doing it to mock them. I'm just using it to differentiate between the way I talk, just so you know who's saying what. Would love to see those who will try to break all this down and shrug off these impossibilities, put it all on the line to prove we went. Well, to be honest, I would love to have an opportunity to go to the moon. I'm not really sure time, finances, and the advancing technology will allow it. Might make it into space some point. I would certainly go. If the moon became available to me, I'd surely be 10th in line. I'm not an early adopter. I'd kind of like the old Titan sub thing around the Titanic. Yeah, let's let about 100 people go ahead of me first just to see how that works. Put on one of those spacesuits and sit in a vacuum chamber 1/3 the pressure of what is claimed to be on the moon. And I don't really understand. This gentleman has an issue with vacuum that I don't understand what he thinks is actually happening. Okay, in a vacuum, there's no inward pressure. It's all outward from you and the lining of air you've got around you. The pressure is all outward generated because there's atmosphere in the suit. The amount of pressure being generated in an absolute vacuum will be 14.6 outward. That means that they have to be able to design a suit capable of withstanding a total of 1 atmosphere without bursting. That's not much. An air compressor in your garage has a 1/4-inch thick wall and does not burst at 100 psi. If you subtract the 14.6, that's 80 psi, which is far more than what the walls of a spacesuit have to put up with. It wouldn't save your blood from boiling, but while you're at it, make sure it's 250 degrees in temperature, then quickly change it to -250. You won't last minutes. Well, firefighter turnout gear will protect up to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for short duration and up to 1,500 degrees for prolonged duration. Volcanologists work in even higher temperatures when they take molten lava samples. Many people work daily in cryogenic environments at temperatures far lower than -250. Jump in a spaceship and sit in the claimed radiation belts. If you think the shielding was sufficient, you'll just be fine. Well, if you watch my videos, I do think I'd just be fine. It comes down to a problem of what do we know and how can we know it? How do you and I know radiation exists? We can't see it. Most people lack the instrumentation to measure it. Some guys in white coats tells us it exists and we generally accept it. How do we know radiation is harmful and how harmful it is? Likely, most of us have never seen the effects of radiation outside of pictures and videos. Some guys in white coats have told us it's dangerous. How do we know the Van Allen belts exists? Guys in white coats. Is all radiation instantly deadly? Well, the answer is no. We both have presumably received X-rays in our lifetimes. We have likely have microwaves in our kitchens. We may have radon gas in our basements and crawl spaces. Some people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki died quickly from the radiation, and others lived to be a ripe old age. We know that radiation exists, has different levels of dangers, and that there's a radioactive Van Allen belt discovered within the magnetosphere of the Earth. This is because scientists have told us this. Scientists, many of the same ones who explained the items in the above paragraph, have also told us that deadly radiation in the Van Allen belt is relatively easy to protect against. They certainly could be lying. However, I, and seemingly you, accept all the other things posited by scientists about radiation without physical proof before our eyes. I've done the research into particle radiation. It seems to line up with what I understood about the physics. That's more solid to me than assertions of the moon landing hoax documentarians comparing Van Allen energized particles to getting an X-ray at the doctor's office. Their comparison won't work. You won't last minutes. The radiation levels at Chernobyl were far higher than what it is in the Van Allen belt. None of them died in minutes. The ones who had the worst exposure took days to weeks to die. Thousands of workers were brought in for the cleanup. With protection and limiting the time exposure, they minimized the death toll, some 24 that we now know of. For more routine matters at a nuclear power plant, they have suits that protect against the levels one might also find in or beyond the Van Allen belt. You make a PowerPoint presentation and think that proves anything. It proves you're willing to actually look at all this and then somehow come to the conclusion that we went. I give more credit to the ignorant. At least they have the ability to say they've never looked into it that hard. Extreme temperature, pressure, and radiation is nothing to shrug off. He loves that word, shrug. Just one of these 3 extreme environments would kill a person. They could have at least scripted in a few astronauts unable to survive the trip. Does anything I say prove? No. And nothing you said proves anything either. Does it give credence to? Yes. You've described the individual environmental hazards that have been overcome prior to space as if they were insurmountable. Yet I'm quite certain firemen, cryogenic process technicians, and nuclear technicians exist. I'm being told to disbelieve my lying eyes. These environmental hazards as a package are not insignificant. The idea that as a package this has been overcome is far more plausible to me than the idea that firefighters, cryogenic workers, and nuclear plant workers can't operate in parameters far worse than space or on the lunar surface. They can't even make a vacuum chamber with the pressure they claim is on the moon. Do you know that? No one can survive the most powerful in existence. That's why they train in underwater and not in vacuum, because they would die. The pressure of one atmosphere is around 14.6 psi. If I get sealed in a spacesuit, the pressure inside the suit, if I use a standard mix, would be about 14.6 on my body and against the suit. If I'm in a suit on the surface of the Earth, the outside pressure is also 14.6 psi. The effect is not additive. The user only experiences 14.6 psi. The suit is experiencing neutral force. The interior pressure pushing out equals the exterior pressure pushing in. If that person goes into a vacuum chamber and reduces the air by half, the inside of the suit stays at 14.6 and the outside is now 7.3. Because of the difference, there is now outward pressure. The suit needs to be able to hold up to 7.3 psi to remain in suit integrity. Put the same person in a vacuum, and now that suit has to withstand 14.6 psi pushing out. Making a flexible material that can withstand 14.6 psi is not a major engineering feat. Consider an oxygen tank. They range around 2,000 psi. 2,000 psi countered by 14.6 psi in the atmosphere. It's a thin wall of aluminum, yet it doesn't burst. He says, I'm trained to work in cryogenics. It's dangerous, as is firefighting. You can't survive all day in either environment. You're shrugging off impossibilities. You do it! Okay, so this got me to see if I could find something else that's a little bit more definitive. And it's an interesting thing I found was something called fire shelters. They are 4-pound, one-man shelters made of aluminum and silica. They look kind of like mylar. They can easily ward off 500 degrees of radiant heat. Wildfire firefighters have survived as long as 90 minutes in the middle of a forest fire front. Decrease the temperature, and that's up to 2,000 degrees. Decrease the temperature to 250, add insulation and a cooling system, and a person can function at a comfortable temperature as long as there's electricity and water. I don't know the radiation exists. The people who all say they went tell us exists. Do you believe them? Okay, and this is some of the stuff that doesn't make any sense at all. Oh, it almost comes across as trolling because, on one hand, radiation's the most deadly thing out there, but we should disbelieve it also exists either. So that's one of the things actually preventing people from getting there. But anyways, people have died of radiation poisoning. There are fission reactors. There are fission and fusion bombs. X-ray machines exist. Until I hear an explanation that explains the phenomenon better than the scientists say, I'd have to call myself a believer in radiation. Ultimately, it comes down to what would get me to change my position. Spoken like a true salesman. You just did a presentation where you shrugged off the impossibilities of the trip. Why? Would you ever, would your view flip if you admit they faked it? What would make you change your position? Would you put on a spacesuit and sit in a vacuum? I wouldn't. I know what would happen. Well, I'm not a salesman by any stretch. If one discovers, it's how you discover you're dealing with a rational argument. At some level, every non supernatural concept must have a test to disprove it. For me, it would be if nothing were found at an Apollo landing site by a lander or a rover. So if a private company or another nation sent a lander there or a rover and there's nothing there, I would definitely disbelieve it. I fully expect that some private or non US government entity will perform such a mission within the next 10 years, something I fully expect to see, barring economic cataclysm basically making it not likely. I will have I'll begin to have some extreme doubts about the Apollo missions by 2033 if no one even considers doing this. And if I hear some reason trying to explain away why nothing can be found, like time has like disintegrated the Apollo mission remains, then I'll be convinced that no missions occurred. Do you have a counter? When you're working in dangerous environments, your focus is constantly on the dangers and what you need to accomplish, or you're done. No worker runs into an extreme environment, then starts playing golf and prancing around. This is not how trained professionals working in an extreme environment act. This was a show. Believe your eyes. You can see it. Well, I would disagree with that. Being in the Air Force, it all depends on the person. A lot of these guys are test pilots. When they go from point A to B, they don't take a train. They don't even care where they're going. They get into test experimental aircraft that's extraordinarily dangerous for no purpose other than just doing it. They want adrenaline and they want to do things a lot of other people don't. People travel to the Titanic when there are perfectly good videos of the entire wreck. Soldiers who've been in combat and who've been shot at volunteer to go, or actually been shot, volunteer for another tour. People sit on their front porch and watch tornadoes when they should take shelter. People skydive when there's no utilitarian purpose to it at all. They can't even make a vacuum chamber with the pressure they claim on the moon. Do you know that? No one can survive the most powerful in existence. This is why they train underwater and not in a vacuum, because they would die. Well, the reason, so you're conflating training and testing. Vacuum chambers are actually relatively small. It wouldn't be a good place to train because there isn't enough room. I mean, at best, you could do the mock up of the interior of a capsule, which would be pointless because you're planning on that being pressurized. Unless you actually have a plan for some reason for it to be depressurized and you need to be working in that environment, there would be no reason to train in there. They train underwater because it more it's the best example we have of long-term uh, changing the weight of objects underwater. It comes the closest to mimicking it because we have nothing that really affects gravity other than the good old vomit comet. Your vacuum shrug-off is false, as are all your other shrug-offs. They don't train in a vacuum because the suits wouldn't save them. In order to make the world's strongest vacuum, they needed 2 feet of steel and 4 feet of concrete surrounding the chamber. That got them 10 to the negative 6 torr. The moon, according to the experts, is 10 to the negative 17 torr. The only guy to go in felt bubbles on his tongue before he passed out. They say a tube came open in his suit, but they simply didn't seal it and throw him back in there. Wonder why? Before you give me your shrug off explanation, why don't you do an experiment? Make something sealable and flexible that can withstand 14.6 psi, put water in it, place it in a vacuum, and show how it can maintain flexibility without the water boiling. If it's flexible, the air will expand, it will balloon, and the water will boil before coming out anywhere close to the vacuum of space. I guarantee it. There's a lot to digest there. Not sure why he went to Tor, because they kind of stopped using that back in the 70s, but it's probably a source from the 70s, like I was talking before. Um, I mean, if that's his proof, I can't do it. I don't have a vacuum chamber, and I can't build one. And I mean, there's some small chambers you can buy about $500, uh, unless someone wants to do a GoFundMe and I can build, set up a vacuum chamber and try to do this. But I mean, even what he's saying here doesn't really particularly make sense. Uh, water water boils in a vacuum because I mean it's same principle of, okay, like if you ever lived at a higher altitude, elevation, water boils at a slightly lower temperature. That's just a given thing. So if you go into a true vacuum, you get to the point where water boils immediately. If you even did what he is suggesting here, let's say I put water inside a sphere and put it into a vacuum, as long as the sphere didn't burst, the water wouldn't boil. It's the lack of pressure that's causing the boiling to occur at a lower temperature. So not really sure even what he's suggesting there. Uh, One of the things we talked about in one of the earlier videos was that when the Russian cosmonauts did their first spacewalk, his suit actually inflated due to the vacuum, and they had trouble getting him back in. They actually had to deflate the suit to get him back in. He got a bad case of the bends from it. He was in pretty bad shape for a while afterwards. The Russian gear wasn't nearly as advanced as the stuff the U.S. was using at the time. So they're basically, the Russians were willing to admit that they kind of screwed up their suit, but it wasn't so horribly designed that it killed the person. And the reason why the suits don't bulge, and you can see there's all kinds of diagrams over the internet giving their explanation of why that is. They actually have a rigid layer in there to prevent ballooning, because they don't want the suit to expand. So I don't understand why it's so difficult. And it seems like he doesn't really understand what's happening with a vacuum. So a vacuum itself has no force. It's the pressure, air pressure in any kind of object inside the vacuum that provides all the force. Vacuum itself has nothing. If vacuum had force, uh, wouldn't okay, let's say you put let's follow his scenario, and we put someone in a spacesuit on the moon, and it just blows up because of the vacuum, because it's pulling out for some reason. Well, wouldn't that suck up all the dust and everything else off the moon? Wouldn't everything in space be under tremendous force if zero vacuum is a force? And the thing is, there's vacuum is nothing, so it can't have force. So all the force that exists in relation to the vacuum is the counter force from the pressure of whatever object is put into it. Uh, a person uh, can, if if they prepare themselves, could live 15 to 20 seconds in a vacuum with no suit. Uh, they're they would lose a lot of water if they'd have to close their eyes or have some kind of eye protection. Otherwise, their eyes would uh, boil away. But if you exhale completely and go from one spot to another, in theory, I mean, if you could like cross a gap uh, and do it in 15 seconds, you have a good chance of survival. You probably get extremely hurt from from what's going on, because overwhelmingly our body is not projecting a lot of outward pressure. The only thing that really has pressure is our lungs, because they're essentially airbags. If you empty them, there's not much to push out on. Our body is essentially designed, the skeletal structure is uh, designed or evolved to the point where it's dealing with the atmospheric pressure pushing out, down on it. It's not set up to create prevent pressure from going in or out. It's our skeletal structure that does it. So our skin itself doesn't really do much along those lines. Uh, so really, the primary pressure isn't coming from us; it's coming from the suit. Vacuum itself is not a force. Vacuum is a lack of force. So, yeah, I think he's got an idea here that the vacuum does something that it doesn't do. And I don't know any other way to impart that idea to him. I'd love to be able to explain it, but hey, he's got his thing. So I explained to you how, what would make me disbelieve the moon landings occurred, and I'd stick to that. If I don't see anything by 2033, that somebody's gone there and reviewed it, I'll definitely be questioning it severely, because I would think somebody with a moon lander or a rover, that one of the Apollo sites would be a prime location, just to, to prove that they're there or not. And also looking at how things age sitting on the surface of the moon would probably be pretty interesting. Who knows? Maybe there's stuff there is actually worth retrieving. I mean, it'd be kind of nice to set up your own little moon museum if you had the ability to retrieve stuff. Okay, well, I think I've beaten this thing to death sufficiently, and we'll move on to a whole new topic here in the next video. So, uh, in the comments below, is there anything this gentleman brought up that you think wasn't addressed properly, or do you have a better way of trying to explain it? Be interested in your take on that, because it's one thing to be able to put it in your head. It's another thing to be able to try to explain it to somebody. So it exists in my head in a way that makes sense to me, but I may have not imparted that the best way. So if you got a thought, I'd like that. Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithm brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, please look at my other titles. You may find what I put out interesting. Please consider subscribing. And if you know somebody who might find this useful, please share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.